The house was too quiet without him. Dad had only been gone for a few hours, but the stillness was already oppressive. It wasn't that I missed him. He was gone most of the time anyway, but his presence always acted as a buffer between us. Between me and her. Lana, my stepmother, was standing by the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone as I entered the room. She looked up when she saw me, offering a tight smile. "Hey," she said softly. "Hungry?" "Not really," I replied, grabbing a glass of water. She nodded, setting her phone down. "Your dad said he'd call when he gets to the hotel." I shrugged, leaning against the counter. "He'll be fine. It's just another work trip." Her smile faltered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Lana and I had never been close. She married my dad when I was 16, and though she tried to bond with me, I never let her in. She was nice enough, kind, patient, always trying to make our house feel like a home. But she wasn't my mom. I didn't hate her, but I didn't particularly like her either. Now, at 23, I still kept my distance. It was easier that way, but tonight felt different. The way she moved through the kitchen, the way her eyes lingered on me a little too long, it all felt off. We ended up sitting at the kitchen table, the silence between us stretching out like a rubber band about to snap. "I don't know how he does it," Lana said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I frowned, looking up at her. "Does what?" "Leaves like this," she said, her voice soft. "I mean, it's his job, I get that. But it feels like he's always gone." I didn't know what to say. She wasn't wrong. Dad worked constantly, leaving her alone in a house that must have felt too big for just one person. "Do you miss him?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the table. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But it's more than that. I feel invisible sometimes, like I don't really matter." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "You matter," I said before I could stop myself. She looked up at me, her eyes glistening. "Do I?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. Lana's vulnerability caught me off guard. She wasn't the type to open up, especially not to me. But there was something in her tone, in the way she looked at me, that made it impossible to ignore. "You shouldn't feel that way," I said finally. She smiled faintly, her lips trembling. "Thanks, Jake. That means a lot." I didn't know how to respond, so I stood up, grabbing my glass. "I should probably head to bed," I muttered. She nodded, her smile fading. "Good night." But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The next day was uneventful. Lana kept herself busy, cleaning the house and running errands, while I stayed in my room, pretending to work on a project for school. But every time I heard her footsteps in the hallway, my stomach twisted. By evening, the tension was unbearable. I found her in the living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. She looked up as I entered, her smile hesitant. "Want to watch something?" she asked, gesturing to the TV. "Sure," I said, sitting down at the opposite end of the couch. We ended up watching some mindless sitcom, neither of us really paying attention. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and I couldn't help but glance at her out of the corner of my eye. She was beautiful in a way I hadn't noticed before, soft curves, dark hair that framed her face perfectly, and a smile that felt almost dangerous. I shook the thought away, focusing on the screen, but it lingered like a shadow in the corner of my mind. The third night was different. Dad had been gone long enough for the house to settle into a strange rhythm, one where the silence didn't feel so oppressive, but instead held a kind of tension that neither of us acknowledged. Lana was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her back turned as she washed the dishes. The sound of running water filled the air, but it wasn't enough to drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. "Hey," I said, leaning against the doorframe. She turned, surprised, and smiled. "Hey, couldn't sleep?" "Something like that," I replied, grabbing a glass of water. She dried her hands on a towel, her movements slow and deliberate. "Want to talk?" We ended up at the kitchen table again, the dim light casting soft shadows on her face. "You don't talk about your mom much," she said after a long silence. I stiffened, my grip tightening on the glass in my hand. "There's not much to say. She must have been amazing," Lana continued, her voice soft. "To raise a son like you." I blinked, caught off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" She shrugged, her gaze dropping to the table. You're kind, Jake. Patient. The way you've handled everything. It's more than most people could do. Her words felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I'm not as great as you think, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening. You are. You just don't see it. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, hoping the moment would pass. But it didn't. Lana reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I'm sorry, she said quickly, pulling her hand back. I didn't mean to. It's okay. I interrupted, my voice trembling. She hesitated, her cheeks flushing. This is strange, isn't it? I nodded, my throat tight. Yeah. Neither of us moved, the silence between us growing heavier by the second. It was Lana who broke the silence. Jake, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever feel like you're missing something? I frowned, unsure of what she meant. What do you mean? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. I don't know. Like there's this emptiness. And no matter what you do, you can't fill it. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Yeah, I admitted. Sometimes. She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. What do you do about it? I don't know, I said honestly. I guess I just deal with it. Her lips curved into a faint smile. You're stronger than I am. The tension in the room was suffocating. I wanted to leave, to put some distance between us, but my legs refused to move. Jake, Lana said softly, her voice trembling. I looked at her, my chest tightening as I saw the vulnerability in her eyes. Before I could think better of it, I reached across the table, my fingers brushing against hers. This time, she didn't pull away. Lana, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on our hands. Don't, she said softly. Please don't. But she didn't let go. It wasn't until much later, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, that the weight of what had happened truly hit me. I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. The way her hand felt against mine. The way her eyes glistened with unshed tears. It wasn't just a touch. It was a crack in the wall we'd both built between us, a crack that threatened to collapse everything. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a moment of weakness. But deep down I knew better. Lana was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her movements quick and efficient as she made breakfast. Good morning, she said brightly, her smile too wide, too forced. Morning, I replied, grabbing a cup of coffee. The tension from the night before lingered in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. Your dad called, she said, breaking the silence. He'll be back earlier than expected. Tomorrow night. My chest tightened at her words. Right, I said, my voice tight. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to me. Jake, about last night. It's fine, I interrupted quickly. Let's just forget about it. Her smile faltered, but she didn't argue. The next day was unbearable. Every time I saw Lana, I felt the weight of the previous night pressing down on me. She was her usual self, kind, composed, and ever so patient. But there was something beneath the surface, a tension that neither of us could ignore. By evening, the house felt too small. I stayed in my room, pretending to read, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her, to the way her hand had lingered on mine, to the way she looked at me, her eyes glistening with something I didn't dare name. I wasn't sure how much longer I could avoid her. It was late when there was a soft knock on my door. Jake! Lana's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Yeah? Can we talk? I opened the door to find her standing there, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She looked tired, her usual confidence replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. What's up? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated, her gaze dropping. I feel like we need to talk about last night. I swallowed hard, stepping aside to let her in. Lana sat on the edge of my bed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I stayed by the door, unsure of what to say or do. I'm sorry, she began, her voice trembling. I shouldn't have let things get that far. It wasn't just you, I said quickly. I could have stopped it too. She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening. Jake, I don't know what's happening. I don't know why I feel this way. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. You're lonely, I said softly. She nodded, her lips trembling. And you're the only one who's here. The only one who sees me. Before I could think better of it, I crossed the room and sat beside her. She didn't move, her gaze fixed on the floor. Lana, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to me, her eyes wide and searching. Jake, Her words were cut off as I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers. She froze, her breath hitching, but she didn't pull away. It was just a kiss, fleeting and hesitant, but it felt like crossing an invisible line we could never come back from. When I pulled away, she looked at me, her expression a mix of shock and something deeper. I'm sorry, I whispered, my chest tight. She shook her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. Don't be. The next morning, everything felt different. Lana was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her movements quick and efficient as she made breakfast. Morning, she said brightly, her smile too wide, too forced. Morning, I replied, grabbing a cup of coffee. The tension from the night before lingered in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. Your dad called, she said, breaking the silence. He'll be back tonight. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Right, I said, my voice tight. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to me. Jake, about last night. Let's not, I interrupted quickly. It was a mistake. Her smile faltered, but she didn't argue. That evening, as we waited for Dad to return, the tension in the house was suffocating. Lana moved through the kitchen with a nervous energy, her hands shaking as she set the table. You okay? I asked, unable to hide my concern. She looked at me, her smile brittle. Fine. Just nervous. Nervous about what? About seeing him, she admitted, her voice trembling. After everything, her words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the silence. Dad walked through the door with his usual booming laugh, his arms outstretched as he greeted us. Lana plastered on a smile, her movements stiff as she hugged him. Miss me? He joked, ruffling my hair as he passed. Of course, Lana replied, her voice light but strained. I stayed quiet, my chest tight as I watched them. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to fall apart. The house wasn't the same with Dad back. His presence should have brought a sense of normalcy, but instead, it only added to the tension that had been brewing between Lana and me. She avoided me as much as she could, her usual warmth replaced by a quiet unease. Dad didn't seem to notice. He was too busy recounting stories from his trip and complaining about work. But I noticed. It was during dinner that things began to unravel. Dad was in the middle of a long-winded story about a client when he paused, his gaze shifting between Lana and me. Is everything okay? He asked, his brow furrowing. Lana froze, her fork hovering midair. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? He shrugged, his eyes narrowing. You just seem distracted. I'm fine, she said quickly, her voice tight. Dad's gaze lingered on her for a moment before shifting to me. What about you, Jake? You've been awfully quiet tonight. I'm good, I replied, forcing a smile. Just tired. He didn't look convinced, but he let it go, returning to his story. Later that night, as I was heading to my room, Dad stopped me in the hallway. Jake, he said, his voice low. Is there something going on? I froze, my stomach twisting. What do you mean? He hesitated, his brow furrowing. You and Lana. You've been acting weird. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled for an answer. We're fine. She's just stressed because you've been gone so much. He nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. If there's something I should know, you'll tell me, right? Of course, I lied. The days that followed were unbearable. Dad's suspicion hung over the house like a storm cloud, his gaze lingering on Lana and me whenever we were in the same room. Lana did her best to act normal, but I could see the cracks forming. She avoided being alone with me, her nervous energy palpable. One evening, As I sat in the living room, Dad walked in, his expression serious. "Jake," he said, sitting down across from me. "We need to talk." I braced myself as Dad leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, "about you and Lana." My chest tightened, my pulse racing. "What about us?" He hesitated, his gaze piercing. "I don't know what's going on, but I know something's not right." "Dad, it's nothing," I said quickly. "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his voice sharp. "I'm not blind, Jake. I see the way you look at each other." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could respond, Lana entered the room, her expression tense. "What's going on?" Dad turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "That's what I'd like to know." Lana froze, her gaze darting to me. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Dad said coldly. "I've seen the way you act around each other." Lana's cheeks flushed as she looked away, her silence speaking volumes. The argument that followed was a blur of shouting and accusations. Dad demanded answers, his anger boiling over as Lana and I struggled to defend ourselves. By the time it was over, the house felt like it was in ruins. Dad stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving Lana and me alone in the deafening silence. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Lana shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know." The silence in the house after Dad left was deafening. Lana sat on the couch, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling with quiet sobs. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to say or do. "This was my fault. All of it. We shouldn't have let it get this far," Lana said finally, her voice muffled but steady. I wanted to argue, to tell her that we weren't the only ones to blame, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. When I woke up the next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Dad hadn't come home, and Lana was nowhere to be found. I found her in the backyard, sitting on the steps of the porch, staring out at the overgrown garden. "Hey," I said softly, stepping outside. She didn't look at me. "He's not coming back, is he?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know." Her shoulders slumped, her expression crumbling. "What have we done, Jake?" I didn't have an answer. It was late afternoon when Dad finally came home. The sound of his car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of panic through me. Lana was in the kitchen, her movements tense as she prepared dinner. I watched from the doorway as Dad walked in, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold. Lana nodded, setting down the knife she'd been holding. "Okay." He glanced at me, his gaze hard. "Alone." I waited in the living room, my chest tight as muffled voices drifted from the kitchen. Dad's tone was sharp, accusatory, while Lana's was quieter, her words too soft to hear. When they finally emerged, Dad's face was a mask of anger and betrayal. Lana followed behind him, her eyes red and swollen. "I'll be staying with a friend for a while," Dad said, his voice tight. "Don't expect to see me around." "Dad, wait," I began, but he cut me off with a glare. "Don't," he snapped. "You've done enough." With that, he grabbed his bag and left, slamming the door behind him. The house felt emptier than ever after Dad left. Lana and I avoided each other, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us like a physical force. It wasn't until a few days later that she finally spoke to me. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "We've already destroyed too much." I nodded, my throat tight. "I know." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. Over the next few weeks, things began to unravel even further. Dad didn't come back, and Lana grew more distant with each passing day. One evening, as we sat in silence at the kitchen table, she finally broke the tension. "I think I'm going to leave," she said softly. I looked at her, my chest tightening. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can't stay here. Not like this." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew she was right. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her lips trembling. "Me too." Lana left the next morning. She didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note. She was just gone. I stayed in the house, haunted by the memories of what we'd done. Dad didn't come back, and the silence grew heavier with each passing day. Eventually, I packed my things and left, unable to bear the weight of it any longer. Years later, I still think about that summer, about the choices we made and the lives we destroyed. I wonder if Lana ever found peace, if she ever forgave herself. I wonder if Dad ever forgave me. But most of all, I wonder if things could have been different, if we could have stopped before it was too late. I guess I'll never know.